From the depths of space, an incredibly ancient vessel drifts slowly towards the Imperium of mankind. On board this space hulk are untold thousands of ferocious alien creatures known as Gene Stealers. The mighty space marines are the only things that stand between humanity and this hideous threat. These brave warriors must enter the tomb-like space hulk and defeat the alien menace that lies within. Hello and welcome to The Lucky Roll, an eclectic channel for eclectic games. And today we're looking at Space Hulk by Games Workshop. More specifically, the 4th edition of Space Hulk that was released in 2014. Now this is predominantly a re-release of the 3rd edition, with some rules changes, but it also comes with new artwork and additional scenarios. It's a game for 2 players, where 2 factions fight for control over a massive derelict ship known as a Space Hulk, over a series of 20-plus missions. One faction are composed of heroic human super soldiers complete with exotic weaponry known as Space Marine Terminators, and the others are alien xenomorph melee-style monsters known as Gene Stealers. Now there is a deep, rich, and complex lore to the factions in this game, and to the actual 40k universe. But the board game itself also has quite an interesting history. It was first released in May 1989 to great success, and won the Origins Award in the States for the Best Fantasy or Science Fiction Board Game of 1989. It received further expansions in the Games Workshop magazine known as White Dwarf, which expanded upon the original game with additional scenarios and rules. It received its first official expansion pack, Deathwing, in 1990, which again expanded the game with additional scenarios, board game sections, and a rules version to allow a player to play the game solo. However, most importantly, it introduced the Deathwing Company of the Dark Angel Space Marines chapter, and gifted the Terminator player with additional Terminator weaponry and additional characters, such as the Captain and the Librarian. This expansion pack also won the Origin Award for Best Fantasy or Science Fiction Board Game of 1990, which in turn highlights how effective an expansion pack this was for the game. A second expansion box, Gene Stealer, was released later that year, which in turn expanded the tactical possibilities for the Gene Stealer player by introducing the Gene Stealer cult, a human Gene Stealer hybrid which allowed the Gene Stealer player to wield weapons, and also introduced a Magus and Primarch Tyranid, Patriarch Tyranid into the game, which allowed the players to engage in psychic combat. It also introduced additional board game sections and scenarios. And finally, there was a Space Hulk Campaigns book, which was released in 1991, where additional boards were added, and rules for Imperial Space Marines against Chaos Space Marines, the effective bad guys of the 40k universe, were added. It also included rules for normal Space Marines in a smaller version of the power armor, who would be much less cumbersome than the larger Terminator Space Marines. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was only the 1st edition. The 2nd edition was released in April 1996 and had revamped artwork and improved miniatures, and was a more simplified and streamlined version of the 1st edition. It reverted back to 2 5-man Terminator squads and changed the mechanics of the game, where the Terminator player could not use spare command points in the Gene Stealer's turn. This changed the tactical strategies used in the game significantly, and eliminated the more powerful characters of the previous editions. Now this edition, the 2nd edition, was expanded upon further by articles, again, in the Games Workshop magazine White Dwarf and the other magazine Citadel Journal, where rules to include things like air ducts, where Gene Stealers could jump from one section of the board to the other, became known as the Defilement of Honor expansion, and a final expansion known as Fangs of Fenris, which brought the Space Wolves chapter into the mix. Sadly, these extra scenarios were never collected as a separate expansion pack, such as the campaigns book in the first edition. Now, the third edition of Space Hulk was released in September 2009, and the game quickly sold out. Within a week, all stocks of the game were gone from shelves, and the mail order supplies were sold out 3 days before release. The game was beautiful. It was incredible looking, with improved miniatures and better playing board pieces, reflecting the advancement of technology in sculpting and printing since 1996. Games Workshop's Alex Hedstrom is the person who designed the modern sculpts for this version of Space Hulk, and gave each Terminator a distinct pose and look. He also gave the Gene Stealers distinct poses, such as bursting through floorboards and leaping off walls, which made them look all the more impressive and intimidating on the board. Now, these sculpts are also the ones used for the current edition of the game, which is the copy we are reviewing. Even the board pieces themselves were revamped. They were made much thicker and heavier, and the use of debossing techniques, which gives a very shallow depression onto the cardboard, gives an incredible, almost 3D style effect on the floor. It's a beautiful effect, and one you do not often see in board games. And finally, we come to the fourth and current edition of Space Hulk. Now, this game was sold out within 24 hours after it was made available for pre-order. However, Games Workshop ensured that its stores had physical copies available on release as well, which is thankfully how I was fortunate enough to receive mine. Now, this edition has additional board sections and scenarios, and there were additional scenarios made available in White Dwarf, December 2017 issue, to accommodate the launch of the Gene Stealer Cultist models. Now, the fourth edition features minor rule tweaks, but as I said, it's largely a re-release of the third edition. Now, the game Space Hulk has expanded into video games, and it's also expanded into a separate card game, but for the rest of this review, we will concentrate on the board game itself. This game comes with an awful lot of stuff. An extraordinary amount. The box comes with 12 Space Marine Terminators, 22 Gene Stealers, 1 Broodlord, 1 Dead Space Marine, 1 Artifact, 1 Cat Unit. You get 2 books, 1 for rules and 1 that has both lore and missions. You get a massive amount of counters to indicate things such as Gene Stealer entry points, Flamer tokens, ammunition, Overwatch, guard, command points, and even tokens to indicate ladders. You get an incredible amount of board tokens with T-junctions, corridors, dead ends, corner sections, boarding torpedoes, turbolifts, and even 11 distinct rooms to make up your game. You have over 20 doors and plastic stands, 1 mission status display board for the Terminator player, an egg timer, and 5 dice. Fortunately, the box is large enough to accommodate all these items, as the game, when it arrives, is in typical Games Workshop fashion, where all the models are on sprues and require assembly. Now, my own models I've painted, as that is a part of the hobby I enjoy, and there is a nice and simple painting guide printed on the sides of the box for any players who are willing to go the extra mile for their game. Now, speaking as a hobbyist, this is a game I thoroughly enjoyed painting, as each Terminator was unique and absolutely beautiful in its sculpt. Even the Gene Stealers didn't feel repetitive to paint, as there is a good variety of model, and the additional details give rise to great potential for additional touches for their bases, such as the mountains of skulls and broken helmets that the Broodlord occupies as part of its base. There are 16 missions that can be played in order, and they offer a fantastic variety in both story, missions, and scenarios for the players to enjoy. Now, every scenario is broken down into excellent detail, with an overview of the map to construct, with varying mission objectives and deployments available to each player, in addition to a small contextual story accompanying each mission from the perspective of the characters, which adds an incredible sense of immersion for each mission. Now, one of the recommendations of the game is that players swap sides after every game, as play is much more difficult as a Space Marine player, and the challenge from a different perspective is refreshed greatly, as the two opposing sides play drastically different to each other. Now, unique missions include the rescuing of an artifact, precious to the Blood Ravens, and the facing off against monstrous gene stealers such as the Broodlords. The Terminators are well named, as they are dauntless killing machines. However, their ferocity is tempered by a lack of mobility and a weakness at melee range, which the more agile, faster, and physically stronger gene stealers excel at. The two factions are exceptionally balanced. However, I do find that it is easier to play as the gene stealers, as there are so many of them that can act as cannon fodder, whereas the loss of a specific Space Marine, such as a heavy flamer or a sergeant, can greatly impact the Space Marine player's options and tactics. The components of the game allow for the creation of very elaborate scenarios, ranging from massive missions such as Beachhead and Unknown Lifeforms that span the entire table, to multi-leveled missions such as the Depths and Pitfall, where ladders and lifts take players from one level to another, which are also massive in scale. Now, this is a beast of a game that will devour your entire tabletop, and is not something that you can play in anything that is not a very large table. Now, there is really only one smaller mission available in these scenarios, which is no doubt affectionately called Suicide Run, and is quite aptly named, as it is a very difficult one for the Space Marine player, and that is the one you see here in front of you. Space Marine Terminators only have 4 points of action per turn to perform their actions with. 1, 2, 3, 4. Whereas Gene Stealers have 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now, a Terminator can only turn 90 degrees per action point, whereas Gene Stealers are much more faster and agile and can completely turn around per action point. Now, Gene Stealers can also move sideways, whereas Terminators cannot. However, Terminators, unlike Gene Stealers, have unlimited range, and as long as they can see a target, they can also shoot it. They can also shoot while moving. Gene Stealers, however, need to get up close and personal in order to effect a kill. And this is what leads to one of the most enjoyable and tense parts of this game, the Overwatch mechanic. If a Space Marine player ends their turn by placing a Terminator on Overwatch, they get a free shot at every Gene Stealer that encroaches upon the area they are covering. For example, if this Gene Stealer here passes this section of the T-junction, the Terminator gets a free shot at them. In this example, however, the Gene Stealers are charging down a corridor towards the Terminator, and the Terminator gets a free shot at the Gene Stealer for every square they move towards them. In order to score a hit with the first shot, the Space Marine player needs to roll a 6 from a pair of dice. Every square after that, however, counts as what's called sustained fire, where the Space Marine Terminator is already on target. Therefore, they only need to roll a 5, and the Gene Stealer is killed. However, if at any stage the Space Marine player rolls a double, the weapon is jammed, and the Gene Stealers can then move unopposed towards the Terminator, intent on glorious slaughter. Now, this can lead to some very tense and enjoyable moments, as every aspect of gameplay hinges on the success of a dice roll. The only exception to this is if the Space Marine player has a spare command point that he or she can use to unjam the weapon and continue firing, but we will elaborate more on that later. Once a Gene Stealer reaches melee range, the combat advantage switches completely to the Gene Stealer player. Now, unless the Space Marine is a close combat specialist, the Gene Stealer rolls 3 dice to the Space Marine player's 1, and the highest roll is the model that wins the melee combat. Now, in the case of Sergeant Gideon here, His Storm Shield reduces the attacking Genestealer down to only 2 dice for their attack, and he gets a +2 to his melee roll, +1 for the use of his Thunderhammer, and +1 for being a Sergeant. He, however, has no ranged attack. Sergeant Lorenzo has a Power Sword, which allows him to force his opponent to re-roll a dice, and gives him a +1 to his close combat roll. And Brother Claudio has Lightning Claws, which allows him to roll 2d6 and add +1 to their rolls. Now the Librarian has a litany of psychic powers that I will explain in the next section, but they can also add points to the combat roll using a finite number of psi points. And finally, the Broodlord has what is called a Mighty Blow, where he still rolls 3 dice, but you add the scores of the lowest and the highest and use that combined number to attack your opponent. There are other ranged attacks, such as the Heavy Flamer, which engulfs the entire board section it targets and is a very lethal area of effect weapon that you can use to clear rooms and corridors. It does, however, have limited ammunition. There is also the Assault Cannon, which rolls 3 attack dice, but must reload after its first 10 shots and then runs out of ammunition. However, to make up for this, its sustained fire bonus means it hits on a roll of 4, 5, or 6. And finally, the Genestealer player has what's called blips, with a number of 1, 2, or 3 written underneath it. Now the Space Marine player is aware of the blips as they move throughout the board, but is unaware of how many Genestealers are actually in play underneath, which allows the Genestealer to allow feints and distractions to what is their actual main attack. Here, the Space Marine player has access to a mission display board, which allows them to keep track of several elements relevant to the game. The first part here is the command point score. The Space Marine player gets to select a random command point token from 1 to 6, and they place it face down on the board, which gives them additional command points to spend on their turn, and the additional points spent are kept track of here. If, however, at the end of the turn, the Space Marine player has spent more command points than they are allowed, they immediately lose the game. Now, if the Space Marine player has a Sergeant, they get to pick 2 command point tokens and keep the one they wish. This is the ammunition counter for the minigun, and it allows the player to see how much ammunition is left on the weapon before it must be reloaded. And finally, the psi counter. The Librarian, or Psychic, has 20 psi points to spend during the course of the game, and they can be spent to either add additional score to a melee attack, erect a force barrier which obstructs the Genestealer player, or they can be used to make a psychic attack upon a single unit. The game is an undisputed classic, with many, many other games based on its mechanics. Space Hulk was the inspiration for another well-known game at the time known as Space Crusade by MB Games, and Space Hulk, quite frankly, is a genre definer in its own right, with even modern games such as Aliens vs. Predator: The Hunt Begins being described not unfairly and not unflatteringly as Space Hulk clones. Now, it's a game that is very closely fought between the players, and it allows for great variance of strategies depending on the scenarios being played. Each scenario has multiple paths to victory, and even the deployment of your Space Marines and the order you deploy them in can greatly affect the strategy for the game ahead. The sheer amount of missions on offer also means it'll take a very long time before you play this game to exhaustion, and the periodic addition of extra scenarios in the issues of White Dwarf, combined with the potential to create your own scenarios, only extends the life of this game all the more. Now, playing as a Space Marine Terminator is much more challenging, as if you're too cautious, you risk getting bogged down. Yet there is nothing more satisfying than setting up kill zones and forcing the enemy into bottlenecks. It is also made all the more challenging by the addition of a timer that forces the Space Marine player to make all their decisions in a finite amount of time, which is great, as it stops analysis paralysis from certain players and forces an otherwise cautious player to be decisive and aggressive. Certain scenarios, such as the brilliantly named Suicide Mission or Beachhead, force the Space Marine player to take territory, and they must balance advancing their Terminators with covering their flanks. Too slow, and you give the Gene Stealer player the advantage. Advance too recklessly, and you expose your flanks or your rear to a crippling assault. It's a simple yet superb tactic, as a well-laid plan can easily go awry from poor dice rolls or even a fortuitous mistake on your opponent's part, forcing you out of your comfort zone to either compensate or take advantage. Now, playing as a Gene Stealer is great fun, as there's no time limit to your actions, and thanks to the extra mobility, multiple entry points, and sheer numbers available to you, you can easily command the battlefield. Seeing your Gene Stealers get slaughtered is balanced by the fact that in many occasions you only need one to slip through the net to cause absolute havoc. A Space Marine attacked from behind has no defense against your melee attacks, and a lone Gene Stealer running amok amongst a squad can be an absolute killer and easily win you the game. The other beauty to this game is that it's also possible for both sides to draw, and that unless you're playing a hardcore mode where dead characters do not carry on into subsequent missions, the story can continue unabated for both players, regardless of whether who wins or loses the scenarios or the levels. Indeed, the game actually urges players to swap teams for a second playthrough, as it gives players a great perspective of the mission from both sides, but also allows you to reuse a setup or a scenario a second time before breaking it down to set up for the next one. Now, the length of the game varies depending on the scenarios, but this isn't a game that will take more than an hour for even the largest scenarios. The rules are straightforward, simple, and the rulebook itself does a great job of explaining the finer points of the game. Now, quite frankly, I can see why this game has the reputation it has, and why it so often sells out so quickly. It is an absolute classic. Now, as for whether I'd recommend buying it, unfortunately the only way you can purchase this game is via eBay or secondhand, and the prices of some of these listings can be astronomical, especially for an unopened box. Now, given the re-release of classic games by Games Workshop such as Blood Bowl, Necromunda and Kill Team of late, it may be possible that a re-release of Space Hulk could be in the works. However, Games Workshop often does leave years between its releases, and it could easily be next year or even 5 years or even longer before another edition of this game is released. Now, given the very little differences between the 3rd edition and the 4th edition of this game, I imagine that the game creators and owners are very happy with its current iteration and may not be too inclined to release it anytime soon unless there is significant demand. On the other hand, however, the release of the 3rd edition was to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the game, and in 2019 this game will be 30 years old. So perhaps GW will once again make a limited run to celebrate its anniversary, or maybe they'll just wait until the 40th anniversary. Now, given the popularity of the computer game Space Hulk, it is a risk for the company. Anyone who is inclined to play Space Hulk may be simply happy with the computer game and have no interest in a physical copy. However, on the other hand, there are a lot more people out there who are aware of the board game as a result, and certain expansions in the computer game, such as the Space Wolves, may give rise to a new flavor of the game, with a fresh take, with a new chapter, different to the Blood Ravens, or it may even be packaged separately as an expansion pack, such as was the case with the very first editions of this game. Now, whatever about buying it, the physical copy I do most certainly urge you to try the game if you get the chance to. And I would most certainly recommend that before you buy the physical game itself, you try the computer game before you invest 200 euros in it, just to make absolutely sure you enjoy it. It is worth remembering two things, however: that this is a game that is best played against a human opponent, and that the computer game, although fun, doesn't capture that. And more importantly, the computer game does not give you the option to play as a gene stealer. The only way you can do that is with the board game. This is Sean from The Lucky Roll. If you enjoyed this review, please like, subscribe, all that good YouTube stuff, because it really does help with the channel. And above all else, remember this: the Emperor protects.